Kyle Thompson.
And you're listening to General Intellect Unit. And this week we are talking about something that we've threatened to talk about for a long time. We're talking about the viable system model as described by Stafford beer quite a while ago. But we're not reading Brain. We're not reading Brain the Firm. That is fucking too much. I've read it before. It's far too much to read in 2 weeks for an episode. So instead, we're reading two resources. We are reading the VSM Guide by John Walker, which was last updated in 2018. And we're reading The Viable System Model as a Framework for Understanding Organizations by Raul Espejo and Antonia Gill. That latter paper is real short and really easy to understand and is a brilliant introduction to the material. So there'll be links to all that in the show notes. Highly recommend checking that out.
Yeah, I would definitely recommend checking out the Espejo and Gill paper before reading the guide. Because that is a really nice synopsis, whereas the guide is really into the nitty-gritty of using the VSM.
Yeah, totally. Like Espejo and Gill is the paper I give to everyone who's curious, as the introduction thing. We'll be doing maybe a bit of an awkward thing. We'll be talking through the guide mostly, but referencing Espejo and Gill as it comes up, or in any place, because it's ultimately two resources that are about the same thing. So they resonate quite hard with each other. There's very, very slight differences in sort of presentation and attitude, I think, in the things that they emphasize and the order that they emphasize things in. But ultimately, it's the same model. Yeah. So, I mean, Kyle, what was your impression of? I'm kind of aware that I think I read Brain of the Firm a while ago, maybe last year sometime. And you've not read Brain, but like, what was your impression of this material then?
Yeah, it was interesting to come to, because it was like, having read Pickering and having read like Cybernetic Revolutionaries, you get that kind of like broad picture of what the VSM is, and you sort of understand it as a whole, as like a abstract whole, but there are insights and there are realizations that I came to just by like reading the guide and going through like, okay, how do you actually like workshop this, right? Like, how do you actually implement this? How do you reason about the VSM or reason with the VSM to understand organizations? What are the specific interrelationships of the different subsystems of the VSM, right? Like, that sort of thing really comes out in these readings in a way that it doesn't in reading a more sort of general text, like the ones we've previously covered. So yeah, so that was really interesting to go through.
Yeah, definitely. And like, I feel like even for the amount of VSM stuff that I've read, like, I feel like every time I read a new thing about it, there's always some kind of little epiphany. There's always something new to be revealed. But yeah, I mean, like with the Pickering stuff or Cybernetic Revolutionaries, like it's very much like, it's a system, right? Okay, well, I mean, like a car is a system, and like my fridge is a system. So like, which one of those is it like? And it's very kind of. It's quite vague, but these materials we're reading here are very, very easy to read and are a great description of the model.
Well, I think that Pickering gets at the broad strokes quite well. It's just, there's only so much you can do with a general presentation. Right?
Especially with Pickering, right? Like, in that Stafford beer chapter is already pushing 90 pages in a...
Yeah,
it's absolutely huge.
I still think that's the best, introductory text to beer out there. It's just, this is a very narrow part of his life and work. Important one, but yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, diving in with the introduction and preface to the VSM guide, Walker leads us off with like kind of a bit of context of why he was getting into this stuff, right? That like it was back in the 80s and he was working with co-ops in Britain, trying to kind of work out the problems of self-management. And in some cases it was like stuff just wasn't really working. They were kind of using like a regime of like elected managers and stuff, but then they found that they were basically just replicating the same old organizational structures they were all accustomed to. But of course, like, these were co-ops, so they were really, really quite into like having a different kind of structure. So I mean, he then hears about it and writes to this guy Stafford Beer, kind of asking these two questions. Like, I mean, is this viable system model, would it be appropriate to apply to cooperatives, and does the viable system model require the use of authority and obedience, right? But like, Beer responds that yes to the first one and no to the second, right? That like the VSM definitely applies to co-ops, and no, it doesn't require hierarchical management techniques of the kind that we all know and hate. Yep.
Yeah, the reason that Walker would assume that maybe it's not applicable to co-ops is because it was originally developed by Beer in doing consulting work for large corporations, right? So if you just looked at the sorts of systems that Beer was analyzing in his consulting work, you might not assume that, this carries over to a co-op, but in fact it does. It does quite well.
Yeah, very much so, which Walker went on to discover. I think I should probably interject here. I think I've met John Walker at Metaforum. A real nice guy. It's weird how small this circle of people really is. I also met Raul briefly, real sweet guy as well. I didn't realize who he was at the time. So Raul Espejo, the author of the other paper here, was the director of Cybersyn, or he was very, very highly placed in the operation of Cybersyn, the application of this model to the Chilean economy in the 70s. So yeah, like he's writing from a place of authority on that, right? Like he's seen it in action.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no doubt. And that paper was written as a brief, like not just for an academic audience, but like to be understandable to anyone with a professional interest. So yeah, it's informed by experience, and it's really well put together.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I mean, the closing remark of the preface then is that, like, I mean, the credibility for this model came from, like, that they had done this in Chile, right, and like that Stafford Beer had this extensive experience with like really hardcore management stuff in huge industry sort of applications. So yeah, moving on to section 0, which I love that they do zero indexing on this. It's the properly cybernetic way to number things. Section 0, cybernetic eyes, right, where we get the fundamental ideas of the VSM and outline, right. He sort of leads off with this, like, the VSM is different, right? And it's because it's so different, it's actually quite easy to lose track of what's going on. Because the VSM is a whole systems theory, and I'm quoting here that almost all other theories of organization think in a billiard ball model of A leads to B leads to C, and therefore miss the essence of what's really going on. They forget that A, B, and C are inextricably linked with a myriad of other factors, and that for any model to work, it must take all of this complexity into account, right? So we're foregrounding complexity, we're foregrounding interactions, right? Like, and sort of messy reciprocal interactions, which he's right, is quite different from our usual way of thinking about organizations, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it is not the waterfall model of work progress. I think this is from Espejo and Gill. They go on to write, the VSM is more in tune with other whole systems ideas like acupuncture, the Gaia hypothesis, most of modern physics, and many aspects of Eastern religions. The trouble is that most of us see the world in different terms, which have their perspectives set by the worldview of Newton and Descartes. And it's, that's something we definitely saw in Pickering, right? That you don't really get the VSM without Beer going to India, right? This is an important inspiration.
Yeah, you need this sort of very different way of thinking in general, not just like a different way of thinking about organizations, but like in thinking about human activity and human minds and brains and so on, right? Because like what they're getting at there with like the Newton and Descartes, and like, I mean, you could throw Plato in there with those guys, is that it's a model of thinking that we're all familiar with, right? Of like rulers overruled, like head over body, mind over matter. Very, very separate, very stratified, very dualistic, right? And there is an isomorphism between like the kind of Cartesian model of mind and body as separate stratified things, and the way that our society is organized, right? Like with stratified, transcendent, like managerial layers that that impose their will on the lower sort of organs, right?
Yeah, definitely. And you could look at the VSM and say like, oh, this is sort of a classic case of cultural appropriation by some white guy going to Asia and taking some ideas and passing them off as his own, and then getting famous for it. But I think going back to what we saw in Pickering, there's a certain way in which I think you can see that's maybe true of Beer's sort of early career as kind of the button-down consultant who really didn't speak about those inspirations for his work, and just kind of passed it off as like the newest wave of operations research. But I think that you kind of see in his later work, there is a certain way in which like he is kind of killing the colonist, the colonizer in his mind, right? Like he is really trying to overcome that prejudice or that colonialist mode of thinking that says that like even if you take inspiration from things you find out there outside of Europe, you have to pretend that never happened, right? Like that these different modes of thinking that they're talking about that are not Newtonian or Cartesian, like they're not actually valuable, right? It's like you have to express it in terms that are acceptable to that, because the priority of the European Academy over all other forms of thinking. But I think he sort of progressively moved away from that, and hopefully that means that the VSM is not sort of like this inherently colonialist text, right?
No, I think you can also. You can also get there by way of Heraclitus and Deleuze and a bunch of other thinkers. I mean, it's definitely not a mainstream in sort of contemporary thought, but there are threads that lead there through all kinds of different ways. But that's the bit that stands out, because that's what Stafford's past was, that he'd spent his time in India, and it's where he'd picked up these ideas. He wasn't reading Deleuze, definitely not.
It was his experience with yoga and tantra and stuff like that really got him there. So yeah, pretty interesting.
Yeah, there's another remark here from Espejo and Gill that again, this isn't particularly well known in contemporary management circles, partially because the ideas are pretty tricky. Like this takes a bit of chewing on to really get. And yet it's counter to this, as we said, counter to this mainstream idea of like top-down hierarchical control. But they go on to say that contemporary technology offers the possibility of a flatter, more network-like organization, right? Where you could emphasize how the rhizome fits together and its operations and flows, rather than emphasizing who reports to who. Because that's the thing with the hierarchical org chart way of thinking about organizations, is that it doesn't actually describe their operations. It describes the kind of chain of blame, which isn't all that useful, actually, when you want to understand an organization, right? Like the fucking chain of who gets blamed by who is kind of a fucking sideshow, right? You really need to understand an organization in terms of what it actually does. And that's the thing that Stafford comes up with over and over again, is that the purpose of a system is what it does, right? The formalism of who reports to who is just a fantasy. Throw that aside. It doesn't actually matter. But back to Espejo and Gill here, they're also saying that with those flatter, more network-like organizations, you also have this danger of losing cohesion in the network, right? This is what we know of as the tyranny of structurelessness problem, where organizations and people have experimented with this. Let's be radically flat as a structure or whatever, and then in the absence of formal procedures and hierarchy, you just end up with informal hierarchy, which sucks real bad. So what's being proposed here is an alternative that's like it gives you the best. It's sort of the best of both worlds, really. It gives you maximal autonomy and cohesion that holds the whole thing together.
Yes, yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's not just this kind of purely negative rebellion against hierarchy. It is kind of a different understanding of organization than a strictly hierarchical one.
And different from the sort of kind of anarchic sort of like, to hell with organization, man, kind of thing, of just like being free-floating fucking particles.
Well, yeah, I mean, more in the sense that like that point of view, I think, still takes as its primary point of reference the problem of hierarchy, right? That's a whole sort of problematic. So yeah, this is kind of, it's not that this doesn't imply some kind of hierarchy. It's just that isn't really what's going on here. Like that's not what we're thinking about. Like we're thinking about, as you said, like what the organization does. It's a more functional understanding than it is this kind of hierarchical understanding.
Yep. And the authors here also touch on stuff that we've covered, I think, before. That is a major problem for Stafford beer, right? The problems of complexity, of variety, and of engineering that variety to come to a dynamic balance with the world, right? And we've been posing a lot of problems there. So what's the answer? And the answer for Stafford was to look to the human brain and the human body as a model of how a complex system organizes itself, right? Like a sort of an example of a hyper complex system, which we're all familiar with, which immanently self-organizes. Like that's a really good organizational model, right?
Yeah. And it's important to note that when we look at that model, when we look at that model of the body, we are not talking about that sort of model that's focused on the brain motivating action in the rest of the body. It's really not that understanding of the body. It's a different understanding of the body that is more holistic, more interactive, more systems thinking, and less about like, oh, we have thoughts and then that motivates our actions. Which is more in accordance with like actual physiology and neuroscience that is being done. It's just that, it's not the sort of common inherited model of the body that we usually think about in terms of like Western society, right?
Yep, totally. So beer breaks down the body into 5 systems, approximately, right? System 1 is all the muscles and organs, the parts that actually do something, and this is the basic activities of the system, which we'll refer to as the operation, or System 1 and operation are kind of interchangeable in this model. System 2 is the sympathetic nervous system, which monitors the muscles and the organs and keeps their interaction stable. The kind of immediate stabilization between sort of immediate muscle groups and between organs. System 3 is the base brain, right? The kind of the upper spinal column and base brain, which oversees all of the sort of internal state and the entire complex of muscles and organs, and kind of optimizes their internal environment, right? Like that's the part that's responsible for keeping the house in order, right, internally. That's your sort of first level of homeostasis there, right, where the internal environment of the organism comes to a sort of approximate dynamic balance, a level of homeostasis. System 4 then is the midbrain. So this is the little bit higher up, and it's connected to the outside world, right, through the eyes and the senses. And this is future planning, projections, forecasting, kind of like prediction, and crucially sort of like folding the outside state into the inside state as a kind of planning engine. And then system 5 is your higher brain functions, right? Like your policy, right, and identity. think of it as kind of like the conscious mind, like the very top level, the cortex. And we've got a funky little diagram as well to go with it. We're aware that like there probably isn't much point. Like the diagram here is basically a sort of abstract diagram of a couple of organs plus a spinal column plus like the 3 layers of the brain. And then on the left, there's this like ellipse that kind of is supposed to be the environment, right? It's all the other stuff.
It's this kind of amoeboid shape.
Yeah, it's very hard to describe, and it's not particularly good radio to try and describe this either. So, plus also, like, I mean, we could describe the objects in the diagram, but like it's covered in arrows and like flows and mutual interactions, and that's the important stuff. So, we'll have links in the show notes. The episode art for this episode will probably be one of these pictures. Please do look it up. Maybe even pause the episode for the moment and have a quick look just to kind of get to where we are.
Because diagramming is a really important part of doing VSM work. Like it is not simply a verbal practice. It is also definitely a visual practice. So it is important to have those images to be able to look at.
Yeah. And then, like, so we've got our 5 systems, but then sort of, if you squint a little bit, you get kind of 3 big groups, right? Like you have operation, which is your muscles and organs, right? System 1. Then you have a meta system, which is the whole nervous system and brain, right? That's your systems 2 through 5. And then you have the environment, which is everything else in the world. So the operation and meta system together are the system, right? The system that we're studying, whichever organization or company or whatever this happens to be, or organism, right? Like, because it's a model that applies to all sorts of different things. Those 2 together are that, and then the environment is everything else that it could possibly interact with, that it could. And this terminology is very sort of core to cybernetics, right? Like kind of considering a system and its environment and what kind of signals and impulses can arrive from the environment and what kind of responses are available. We're not going to go into a huge amount of that, but like we have previous episodes on the cybernetic brain and designing freedom, which are like highly recommended as follow-on episodes from this one.
Yeah, and I think that the important thing to note there is like the terminology, right? The operation and the meta system are what form the system in question. And it's not the, the processor and the implementation or whatever. It's not like a peripheral. The operation is really where most of the action is happening. And the meta system is exactly as it says. It's meta, right? It's not the core, right? And the operation is not purely enacting a thing. It has its own kind of cognition involved in it. So that's really important to understand how this conception of organizations actually works. It isn't about a directorship and the implementation of the direction.
Mm-hmm. It's about the operation, the actual activity comes first, and the management is in service of that. Because like the challenge, as always with a cybernetic the analysis, is that the challenge is for the system to come to a dynamic balance with its environment, right? To survive and to thrive, right? Like that's the viable, right? In the thing, because like a system that's not viable just gets swept away. It dissolves in the environment, gets torn to shreds and falls apart, right? So the operation has to come to balance with that thing, and the meta system, the management, is there to assist in doing that. It's not. It doesn't take precedence of its own. But one of the sort of important things to emphasize here as well, that we're talking about this like ecology of organization inside the system, right? Like it's not. We're emphasizing relations and communications among mutually involved systems or subsystems, right? We're defocusing things like singular objects or singular kind of systems. And so the way Walker puts it here is that, I'm quoting, "This balanced whole system approach solves many of the dilemmas with which traditional models struggle. Should we centralize or decentralize? Should we devolve power or appoint authoritarian managers?" So, like, linking back to his kind of original kind of problem statement, like this, he found this stuff to be an answer to those problems. Should we decentralize or centralize? Both / neither. Should we devolve power? Or should we devolve power? Yes. Should we appoint authoritarian managers? No. Like, the model informs this, right?
The model kind of argues that a lot of our traditional sort of thinking about these problems is really like thinking about pseudo problems. Right, like we haven't correctly identified what the real problem is, and this is providing both a different problematic and a solution for dealing with that problematic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And yeah, I mean, so like but the stuff that we're accustomed to, right, is authoritarian management as a solution. What's it a solution to? Oh, it's the solution to the problem of class reproduction. It's like the thing that it does solve is a thing we don't want at all, right? So and this kind of loops in with, well, like, why are we covering this, right? Like, I mean, it's our belief that this socialists and communists need to organize a mass movement of people and in the workforce and all this sort of stuff, right? And like, in order to do that, you need organization, right? But like, we're often pretty shit at that, and we sort of, when questioned with like, okay, but what does this new world look like? We just sort of stand there and go, don't know, haven't thought about that, which is bullshit, right?
Yeah.
So, if you, I think we mentioned it in a previous episode, but if you have pretensions to like taking over the state, like, you have to care about organization and what organizational systems are. Or if you pretend to replace the state with whatever, you know all the caveats in the world, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think when you take this to its logical conclusion, similar to where you get with Marxism, it's not really compatible with a state. It's not really compatible with a class society. Of course, you can create viable systems within the context of a class society or within the context of a state, but when you really generalize it, I think it does imply communism.
Yeah. So it's an answer to that sort of big question then of like, it's one we're sort of posed pretty regularly of like, okay, if your plan is to dissolve the state and to move to something beyond it, well, what is that thing beyond it? And this is, an indication of what kind of large-scale coordination systems you could possibly have that would not be a state in the sort of way we know, like the Platonic Cartesian model of state thought. This is very different, but it is also not like Kaczynski-style primitivism, It's an answer to that question, right? Like, what comes next? What kind of social, economic, organizational structures are you proposing? We're proposing to do what they did in Chile on a gigantic scale. That's the concrete proposition. Moving on a tiny bit then, kind of abstracting those 5 systems away from the body concretely, you get System 1 as primary activities or value production, System 2 as conflict resolution and stabilization amongst the System 1s, or Systems 1. Which way are you supposed to pronounce it? Like, is it System 1s or Systems 1? I can never figure it out.
I see what you're saying, yeah. Oh, yeah. Ooh, I don't know. I've never run into that problem before in English.
They're plural, right? The System 1 is plural.
Yeah, right.
System 2, 3, 4, and 5 are singular. So yeah, like 2 is your conflict resolution and stabilization. System 3 is internal regulation and sort of synergy optimization, right? Like kind of taking the whole picture into account and saying, okay, if we increase blood flow here and we get more oxygen to this, then we can turn down that. And like it's the kind of a little bit higher, and it's turning more dials, right, than System 2 is.
Yeah, it takes a whole view of the internal part of this whole thing.
Yeah. System 4 is our adaptation and forward planning and kind of like monitoring of the external environment, and then System 5 is your policy and identity and sort of ultimate authority at the top. For Espejo and Gill, they actually don't use the terminology systems 1 through 5 at all. They call it implementation, coordination, control, intelligence, and policy, which I think is a gigantic leap forward as well, because systems 1 through 5 sounds just so dorky. We've stuck to the VSM guide terminology just for the sake of consistency, but I do prefer Espejo and Gill on that one.
Yeah, I think maybe my only qualm with the reformulation is this idea of implementation is System 1, because yes, it does have to perform according to a agreed upon role, but it does have a kind of more active creative dimension to it than just implementation.
Implementation as a subordinate kind of hand me down some instructions kind of vibe to it.
And I think one thing that's really interesting to note is that the description of System 1, it says, primary activities, right? Like it's like this is primary, and then to add emphasis, it says value production, right? So like this is some real like labor theory of value shit here, right? Like like the value of the system is produced in System 1. Like it is the primary locus of valuation. So that is quite interesting to me as a Marxist at least. Yeah,
absolutely. I think that's very interesting, and it actually sort of it's not that the problem is posed here specifically, but it's a problem in political economy anyway, right? Like that, how do you it's sort of how do you account for things that are sort of not exactly direct commodity value production but aren't really support functions either? So that sort of ambiguity is here too, but I mean
it is, yeah. They kind of get into that problem a bit, and like actually that problematic is inherent to defining System 1, because you have to define the contours of System 1, and one of the criteria you can use to delineate what is System 1 is what parts of your organization are producing value, right? And then, so it really does get to that productive, unproductive labor problematic that you get in classical political economy, where you have people who are like making the things that actually are realized for value, and then the people who are doing the things that are facilitating value production, and it actually so when you look at that in classical political economy, it tends to be like a really kind of strict division. But when you look at the way the VSM actually works, there's often going to be the same people working in System 1 as in all the other systems, right? Like there is a certain fluidity and a certain level of like functionality to this analysis that doesn't like essentialize these are the value producers and these are like the non-value producers.
Yeah. That's something that's worth kind of pointing out here or elaborating on, is that when you see the diagram of this thing and you see these little boxes, it's very easy to jump to the conclusion that those are like roles or job descriptions, that like you put a person inside each box and that's their sort of job. That's not the case. What I like about the VSM is that it sort of depersonalizes management, and it turns it from being a sort of facialized role that some people with some privilege have. It sort of gets away from that and makes it more like a machine function, that these are meant to be kind of automated processes in which the members of the organization kind of nomadically migrate through these sorts of systems. I mean, for one thing, like if you're in the shower in the morning and you're wondering about how your company will adapt to a certain upcoming challenge, you're sort of inhabiting System 4 at that moment. While when you get in the car and you drive to work and you get in and you start banging a wrench against something or whatever, that you're operating in System 1. If you then go and like have to have a meeting with somebody from a different department to sort out, I don't know, where a box of stuff went missing or whatever, both of you are operating in system 2 for the moment, and then when you have your weekly or bi-weekly kind of retrospective meeting, like the all hands meeting, you're all up in the kind of system 4, system 5 layer. So we're really getting away from personalization of management here into this kind of abstract automation flows that end up kind of, managing. Everyone ends up managing in a sort of way. It's kind of strange and kind of hard to adapt to initially, because you stick to that notion of like, no, a manager is a person who sits in a chair, like a specific chair,
It's quite interesting. It is possible that an organization could formalize these all out into separate roles, but it kind of goes against the grain of the VSM to some degree. There's more of a desire and a tendency to try to avoid that kind of isolation of roles in the system. Yeah,
which is great, and that serves us perfectly as communists, right? So moving on a little bit more, Walker goes through some of the meta system in more detail, right? Like, and he uses this sort of metaphor of eyes, right? That like you have this internal eye that's like system 2, 3, that's like facing inside into the system, and it is creepily rendered in like probably a whole 40 pixels worth of fucking JPEG on the page. It is great.
Yeah, there's a diamond with eyes growing out of it. Yeah. It's pretty wonderful.
It's the quality of the art here is fucking terrible. But it's charming. It is charmingly bad, right? And then you have the external eye at the sort of level of system 4 that's facing the world, right? And that's again what we were on about with like keeping internal balance, and then once you've got your house in order, keeping external balance.
But it's worth noting here that like internal eye, external eye, like this is stuff that comes like straight out of like tantra or meditation or whatever, right? Like all of these kinds of internal practices. You could point to examples for that. Yeah.
And the general sort of structure of all of this is that the operational units, the sort of things that make up System 1, are allowed as much autonomy as possible, but they're sort of reporting upwards, right? Like sort of this is to do with this variety engineering thing that like ultimately in a highly various scenario or with a highly various problem, the only people or systems that are capable of dealing with the problem are the people kind of closest to the coalface. So like the thing here is to devolve power and decision making as low as possible, to let as much autonomy go to the lower levels, with the only exception to that being the kinds of restraints on autonomy that are required for maintaining overall cohesion. And that would mean like the set of systems 1 get on with whatever they're doing and just report periodically upwards or send alert signals when things go wrong, and that goes up the spinal column to the midbrain, basically, to the internal eye, right? Which is, and if system 3, the midbrain, it spots a sort of opportunity for synergy or for like internal optimization, it'll kind of issue instructions downwards or plans or whatever you want to call them, right? It's like, oh, hold on, if you go over there, then we can do this. Or if this project is now delayed by 2 months, that means we can reallocate this resource to this other project. So it's this reciprocal feedback loop of like information goes up and down, as it does in the body, right? And then at the sort of level of System 4, all that information from 3, like the way it's rendered in the diagram is that there's a kind of a circular feedback loop between systems 3 and 4. Like they're deeply involved in each other because they're constantly exchanging information and kind of folding the internal state into the external state and producing this like continuous adaptive planning, which is like we were talking before about like planned economies and so on, and like using economic planning. That's kind of where that would sit, right, in this kind of 4-3 loop of like, the cockshot stuff would be there basically at level the 3-4 sort of divide, or the 3-4 engine or motor. I like to think of it as like a motor of planning or a motor of adaptation.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, what we've talked about in People's Republic of Walmart was sort of like the way in which there is cybernetic feedback between multiple levels of like the Walmart planning system. That's very much in accordance with what the VSM would prescribe.
And listeners might be sort of thinking, well, hold on, if this stuff is so wonderful, why don't people do it? Beer's answer to that is that actually they do. Like the kind of the theory here is that all actually viable systems kind of match this pattern if you squint at them. That like the viable system model is kind of firstly intended as a diagnostic framework, that you sort of hold up the diagram and you look at your organization through the lens of the diagram, and you see, oh, those are the value production centers. That thing is kind of equivalent to a spinal column. Oh, like I can see where the planning and stuff happens. And then you might spot that like, oh, there isn't really a system 3 in my organization. It's kind of like, you know, brain dead at that kind of level. Or there might not be a policy level. There might just be sort of a kind of chaotic swirl of stuff, right? So you're meant to be able to look at it and say, you know, to look at a real system and see it through this sort of lens. So the answer to that is that, like, unconsciously, Walmart probably do this without even realizing it, right? Because if they didn't, they wouldn't have survived, right? That's the kind of theory here, is that systems that do survive and do adapt to their environment can be analyzed in this way and will almost entirely match the thing. Sometimes you'll find a vestigial tail or a gap, right? Like a classic one is like founder syndrome for like startups, where, you know, the founder is involved in just fucking everything, right? Like development, support, you know, issuing credit card refunds, all that sort of stuff. And you would diagnose that as being like, you have a system 5 and systems 1, but 2, 3, and 4 are just missing, lobotomized, right? Like, so yeah, that's, I feel like that's an important one, that like, it's not so much a proscriptive model. Well, it kind of is in some ways, but it is definitely a descriptive or diagnostic model.
Well, and I think what you can point to with an example like Walmart, it's like, yes, they definitely are a viable system. They do conform to this layout in some ways, but we also have to take into account the fact that you know, capitalism kind of pushes against the tendency towards devolution of power and responsibility that the VSM prescribes. And so it may be possible for an organization to be viable within capitalism while still like blatantly ignoring, you know, one of the most important dictates of the VSM, because the competition is also following that, and you know, the state of class struggle sort of enforces a dysfunctional perpetuation of the system,
which would trap them in a kind of local optimum, right? Like they could be a lot more effective by like, again, this variety engineering, sort of like Ashby's law of requisite variety, right? That you'll have systems that are viable in their current configuration, but could be a lot more viable in a better configuration. But anyway, Walker then moves on to a bit more of a description of System 1, and the kind of main point here is that the model is recursive, that each of the System 1 subunits is itself an entire copy of this diagram, and is itself viable, and so on and so forth until you get way down, right? And that these subunits should be left to be largely autonomous, but then held together by the metasystem in ways, in whatever way they need to, right? Like to just maintain overall stability. And it's also important that each of these sorts of we talked about how the high level organization deals with its environment, but each of the subunits deals with a subsection of the environment, right? So like a classic one would be like for a company, the environment is all the stuff like distributors, fucking vendors, customers, you name it, right? Like everyone's in there. But the subunits might be, you know, shipping or like order taking or like some sort of production thing, like a factory thing or whatever. Or, you know, like material production stuff, or like customer support as well could be another one. And each of those is sort of mostly dealing with a subsection of that environment. So they're also dealing with each other. Something that's kind of not rendered very well in these diagrams, but is rendered better on Beer's own models, is that the System 1 subunits are deeply entangled with each other. Like there's a mesh of like immediate nervous system activity between, say, you know, sales and support and development or whatever, and shipping, you know, as the sort of the things, right? And that a lot of the sort of direct interactions won't ever rise to the level of even System 2 becoming aware of them. They're just sort of immediate direct interactions. System 2 and upwards only step in when there's a problem, like when there's when those interactions go bad and there's oscillation. Like one of the examples that's used somewhere a bit later in this guide is where you have 2 floors of a factory, right? And there's a shipping, like a freight elevator going up and down, or there's a set of freight elevators. But then sometimes a pallet goes in the freight elevator and it kind of gets stuck because nobody takes it out at the top or whatever. And so there's a kind of a contention for a resource. And that's the part where a sort of System 2 would get involved, right? Because if things run smoothly, you don't need to do anything. It's only when things go wrong that you need to do any kind of management.
Yeah, the example was that you get a pallet going up the elevator that neither floor considers to be its domain of responsibility, so they just send it back and forth infinitely. And the System 2 is what resolves that kind of loop of behavior, right? It's kind of exception handling, right?
Yeah. It's you know, it resolves instabilities, but the thing is that if there's no instability in the first place, well, lucky you. You don't need that system. You don't need to do anything today in that system.
Yeah, that's the really important thing here, is that like there is a certain sense in which the VSM really goes against the grain of like, maybe not the necessary practice of sort of like the connected world, the big data world, the idea that you need to have a sensor for everything in every place. It goes against it by saying what you want to do is limit the information that is going upward in the system to the stuff that really matters. Like, don't just like, you know, bulk collect every kind of data under the sun. And like Beer was very explicit about this in the Designing Freedom lectures, right? Like he's like, yeah, like you don't want to have just this flood of information coming up to the top and being processed to no end whatsoever. You really want to restrict the information to the important stuff. What he calls like algodonics, right? This kind of like, if there's a problem, then somebody needs to be informed of it. But if there's no problem, then we don't want any data at all, right? Like we don't want any notification at all, I guess is what you should say. Beer would be very against push notification proliferation, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, totally. Because it should be exceptional, right? Like algodonics is about like pleasure-pain signals in biological systems. So the kind of general rule here is only send a signal when there's a problem, and otherwise just provide your sort of general weekly reports or whatever to be fed into the statistical machine. But yeah, otherwise you don't need management involved if they're not needed. You know, if it's not needed. Yeah. So one thing that's maybe interesting is that Espejo and Gill emphasize they sort of present their thing a little bit differently, where they emphasize the recursion up front, and they sort of fill out the details later. But I think it's just an interesting sort of thing that like you can view this same object from a couple of different angles and emphasize the bit that you like. Yeah, so a later section brings us on to some case studies, which are pretty interesting, right? Like we get examples from like a small Whole Foods cooperative, and then we get an example from a kind of larger larger Whole Foods cooperative again, but like one that's got, I think, multiple sites, and I think they get into the tens of employees rather than the sort of single digits. And then the bigger example is Mondragon, the Federation of Cooperatives. These are well worth reading in detail. We're going to kind of just pick on some of the more interesting kind of standout bits here. What stood out for me was that like the differences in scale here really changed like how you need to deal with things, because like for the small shop with like five workers, like in the cooperative, their sort of imminent activity of just doing the job forms this kind of natural system 2, 3, 4, 5 kind of thing, where I think the way he puts it is that like the system 3 is the kind of like model of the internal state, and it just sort of emerges naturally from the interactions of the people. So they end up kind of naturally inhabiting all these different roles throughout the day without the formalism. But the downside of that is that when, because it's kind of really tied to these particular people, and it can degenerate into a non-viable form when, say, somebody is ill, right, or absent, or somebody has to do delivery across the country or whatever. You can end up operating with a sort of semi-lobotomized kind of midline
yes.
at that time. Which I thought was pretty interesting. Some of the recommendations there were for to kind of keep more explicit data around, like he talks about like performance indicators and stuff to have them measured properly and displayed, but also just like taking the time to plan and optimize, like, because with a small shop it's easy to just get completely buried in just the activity of doing the job at all, but they needed to really take the time out to say to themselves, okay, we're going to sit down and we're going to do system 3 now. We're going to do our internal optimization, and then tomorrow evening we're going to sit down and do our sort of quarterly planning, our system 4 operation.
Yeah. And they had sort of technologies that they could use to help with this too, right? Like they had like poster boards and that kind of stuff to just help keep system 2 operative. Yeah.
That's a big sort of theme throughout all of this, is that system 2 ideally should be taken up with just kind of, I guess, sort of like data practices or like IT infrastructure stuff, like high bandwidth communication channels that can be used to like just either resolve conflicts when they come up or simply prevent conflicts from happening. Like I think I've seen pretty regularly with say software development teams where you have a team that's working on multiple projects, and you would think of the separate projects as system 1s or systems 1. One of the ways of avoiding conflicts is to use a version control system and a decent workflow for like bug tickets. So system 2 in that case doesn't end up being a singular system. It just ends up being a set of policies and procedures that are sensibly worked out to just avoid collisions in the first place. It's like the way you avoid problems with driving, right? Is like you don't try to resolve collisions between cars. You try to stop the collision from happening in the first place. And that sort of patina of procedures and sort of internalized rules is your system 2.
Yeah, like in the examples given in this text, I think they often refer to like the cooperative ethos as their system 2. Just the sort of the mores and values of working in a cooperative and having a common interest operate as a system 2. Because they have a common interest, so people are going to work to basically load balance efficiently because they have the common good in mind, as opposed to being like in the People's Republic of Walmart episode, we saw the different units that are all at each other's throats.
Yeah, the Sears example. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, exactly.
or to riff on our sort of earlier example of the freight elevator, maybe system 2 is implemented as like a procedure where, like, firstly you stick a note on the pallet as to what floor it's intended for, and they take it out there. Or if the note is missing and the thing is just like noticed to be off, you hit a little alert button that flashes a light on each floor, and then the elevator goes to the bottom floor, and it gets unloaded there until somebody can come pick it up, and that's just the procedure. And it's not going to solve who put the fucking pallet there or whatever. That's not what's going to be solved. It's the oscillation and the sort of bullshit. That's what'll be solved by that procedure. And that's the immediate concern. And that's analogous to like when you're lifting something with your body, right? Like you're picking up something, your muscle groups are working together and kind of reciprocally kind of vetoing each other through. Like, I mean, one muscle wants to pull really hard, and the one on the opposite side of the arm wants to go the other way, and it's just sort of, it balances out, and like the balance of like oxygen in your bloodstream is balanced out this kind of way, where it's like you're running to catch a bus, right? And it's like one system is saying, give me as much oxygen as possible, and there's another system saying, whoa, hold on, can't, like, oxygen's poisonous in huge doses, don't do that, you know. And it's an automatic system that kind of finds the balance in there.
Yeah, it's like if, in that example of like when you're lifting something heavy, it's your muscles working together in a way that you're not really even consciously aware of. It's prior to there being a pain signal of, oops, this is too heavy. That would be more at the level of like, you know, the system 3 and 4 kind of deal, right?
Sure. Moving on a bit, yeah, the example of the sort of medium-sized business was this place, Triangle Whole Foods, about 35 workers, and like one of the problems they'd found was that early on they were fine with just having kind of this big meeting each week to like the first example, right, to just figure stuff out.
Yeah, that was actually appropriate for that size of cooperative.
But at 35 or 40, it becomes really unwieldy. And so what's interesting here is that there's explosive growth in the operations level, like in the system 1, but the brain doesn't grow big enough to catch up with it. You know, you have this massive operational complexity and not enough metasystem to catch up with it. So it sort of just dissolves and breaks down. The sort of big recommendation here was to do cell division into departments, right? To kind of introduce a layer of recursion, so that you would have you go from being one recursion to being to two. So you have the overall company is made of a couple of system 1s, and then they themselves are made up of system 1s. And that meant that the planning, like each subunit could do its planning in parallel on its own schedule and with less people involved. So that kind of like shrunk the problem. So this thing, right, to meet Ashby's law, you can either grow the size of the solution or shrink the problem, and both of those are valid, right? But like, you know, it's often easier to shrink the problem than it is to grow the solution bigger, because then if you grow the solution, that becomes a problem in itself, right? Because you just end up with more complexity.
Right. It's almost exactly the example that Beer gives in his talk about the department store, right? You know, breaking that problem of people wanting different things down into departments.
Yeah, and the example from Mondragon is really interesting. Like this big federation of cooperatives in Spain, I believe.
Yes, it's in northern Spain. Yeah.
But the author here was kind of amazed that, like, he was like, "Are you sure you guys have never heard of this beer guy?" Like, it was. It sort of naturally evolved into painfully naturally evolved, because, like, I mean, it scaled up pretty huge, right? But, like, they had found the same principles, basically, right? That it ended up being kind of recursively subdivided with, like, pretty clear distinctions of, like, what kind of responsibilities are occurring at each level. You had, like, workers' participation in the sort of, like, workers' councils and management layers and this sort of stuff. And he was like, yeah, like, are you certain you haven't heard of this viable system stuff? Because it's really eerily familiar.
Yeah, I think the important thing to note here about the Mondragon example is this was an observation that he made on a visit to Mondragon, I think in '91, and so this is prior to Spain being incorporated into the European Common Market, and so I think a lot of the really serious criticisms people have of Mondragon come about after this period, when basically the free market in Europe imposes a capitalist logic on the organization and starts to degenerate what its principles and standards of operation are. This is maybe a little bit of Mondragon at its best, as opposed to what it's often criticized for now.
Yeah, which is a damn shame. Interesting though that Beer's thesis was borne out, right? That a sort of really viable organization, when it was put to this lens to view it through, it was holy shit, that lines up perfectly, right? Really, really interesting validation of the theory there. So section 3, preliminary diagnosis, is kind of stepping through. This is where the guide it takes on its kind of character as a guide, right? It's getting a little bit away from the sort of just description of the model and into a bit of a how-to guide of how to do each of these things in piece by piece. The general gist here is to map identify the organization you're interested in and map it onto the diagram and kind of fill in the boxes and think about what practices you do currently map onto the components of the system. So what is it that you do right now that corresponds to stabilization and conflict resolution? What is it that you do right now that corresponds to forward-thinking planning? How is policy decided? This sort of stuff, right?
And it's important to note that you may not actually find a corresponding system in your organization for each of the 5 levels, and that is just something you would note down, because what that suggests is that you do not have that system, and you probably should. It's either something that is done kind of implicitly, as in the first case study we looked at, right? There was no real system 5, so to speak.
Well, I think the way it would be put there is that there is a system 5. It's just it's implicit, but it's a
right, exactly. It's not formalized. And that may not be a problem, but it may also be a problem, and in which case you would want to implement some kind of formalized system 5, right?
And our other example being because it's an egregious example, the founder syndrome, right, where it's systems 1 and 5 are present, but everything else is missing. Or we've all probably worked at places that had absolutely no forward planning whatsoever. It was all just pure reaction. So that system 4 was completely absent, or ones that had maybe really great forward vision, but internally their house is a mess. Or any of those, or say an example where system 2 would be missing would be that there's Sears, right, with the cutthroat sort of antagonism between departments that should have been working together. That would have been the absence of a kind of stabilizing nervous system. And an absence of system 3 and 4 and 5, because that fucking guide.
Well, it's in that sense, the organizational form that they set up in Sears there is kind of an anti-viable system.
So the dark,
right? It is a system that isn't actually committed to viability, right? That's not a founding assumption of how it's organized. So it fell apart.
So that's an interesting point as well, because we should also probably clarify that not all systems in the world, or not all sort of social assemblages, will be viable systems. Going back to designing freedom with the example of the waves on the ocean, right? They are imminently non-viable. Their whole nature is to not continue. They do their thing and then they crash on the beach, and that's it. So the queue at Starbucks is a social assemblage, but it's not a viable system. It doesn't have a self-continuous identity that it itself tries to maintain. It doesn't have planning. It doesn't have internal stabilization. We are talking specifically about a particular subset a particular subset of all social machines where the social machine is set up and intentionally trying to survive and to continue. Yeah, so like as I said, like define what's in focus, right? Like get out the pen and paper and draw up some stuff, right, and start filling in the boxes.
Yeah, the important thing here is to understand what the purpose of the system is.
Yeah. Like at the system 1 level, like what does this thing actually do, and which parts of the environment does it interact with while doing? So I mean, in the diagram they have here. The author goes through like filling out a diagram piece by piece with JPEGs, and the system 1, the operational units that he identifies are warehouse and order pickers, transport, cash and carry, manufacturing and order takers, and each of those has a mapping to a part of the environment, right? So this is what are you doing, and how does what you're doing interact with the outside world?
Yeah, and I think the point of the writing the purpose of the system, you're really trying to come up with a kind of like meta statement of what those things amount to, right? So like, the example is given there of, Beer talking about like, what is it, the British Railway, and like the purpose of the system is to convince him not to travel by rail. This is before it was privatized. So that was a point that I really wanted to like read a little bit more about. Like, how do you actually define the purpose of the system? Because it is defined by, like, to some extent by what it actually does, right? Like there was another example that I think Walker gave where it was like, oh, you might think that the purpose of your, like, I think it was supposed to be like, some kind of like Trotskyist sect or something. Like, the purpose of our organization is to overthrow capitalism, right? But when you actually examine the operation of the system, you find that the purpose of the organization is to sit around and drink coffee. So, so I'm really interested in like what's the exact like procedure you would go through in doing this VSM work, in like figuring out like what is the real purpose of this organization, and then like also the question of like reconciling sort of the ideal purpose of the organization and the actual purpose of the organization, because that is a point that Beer brings up in the Designing Freedom lecture, right, where he's talking about like systems that are viable in a sort of like malignant sense, like the viability of the bureaucracy and its capacity to reproduce itself. But like that being negative for society as a whole. So yeah, because we typically think about viability in positive terms, but a system can actually also be viable in terms that we don't like at all.
Yeah, I mean, like one of the assumptions that's definitely here is that it's an assumption of a sort of pragmatic evaluation of performance, which is a big cybernetics thing, right? But and this is where the sort of the psychoanalytic crowd will get kind of excited, right? But like it kind of assumes that the motivations will be available to you and be scrutable, and so on. So there's like quite a bit going on there. That's like, maybe in some cases you won't be able to identify what the purpose of it really is, or that like there'll be these unconscious, like institutionally unconscious contradictions between the stated purpose and what the actual performance is, right? Like in that kind of very, very sort of Freudian way.
And that's where like doing the VSM work can be quite a revelatory investigation, right? The actually doing the work of analyzing through the VSM can put your organization in a different light than the one you entered into the analysis with. And so that sort of definitional level of the purpose of the system is actually very important and actually quite complicated, or quite a complex problem to work through.
I think that's why I find I'm kind of fascinated by the intersection of like cybernetics with psychiatry and with like with all sorts of other things, because like if if a human body can go mad, right? Like it can be sort of pathological in some ways. It stands to reason that an organization can as well, and a machine can go mad. There's a really great book, part of Cybernetic Brain, where Pickering describes like how Ross Ashby managed to like drive a machine insane by like giving it contradictory instructions and like got it into a really fucked up state. Like he was simulating a kind of very primitive electronic brain, and the electronic brain exhibited the same pathologies under the same stimulus as a human brain. So I mean, yeah, I think to really do that sort of analysis that you're asking for there, of like really analyzing what a system is and what it does and what it claims to do, you would need to bring a kind of psychiatric kind of toolkit to the table as well as a cybernetic one. But then, I mean, cybernetics kind of blurs those lines, right? Like that's
right. Yes. Well, and I think the important thing here is that like this is a process, right? Like you don't just sit down and say, okay, right, like, let's look at general intellect unit. Okay, what's our purpose? Okay, write it down, done. All right, that's the end of that. No, it's something that will become clear to you as you go through the diagramming, the discussion, and looking at the interactions of systems, and with the environment. Then you like, so I imagine there are some kind of there's a certain level of like revising the purpose that happens as you go through the analysis.
Oh, I'd imagine so, certainly. One of the sort of interesting examples that stood out for me for System 3, like the System 3 being about optimization of the whole internal system, was the example of like a bucket chain to move water. Like, say the problem is that a house is on fire and there's a lake nearby, and you've got 10 or 15 people running back and forth with buckets. But you've got somebody at the top of a ladder who looks at this scenario and goes, oh, hold on. If you all stand in a line and you pass the buckets back and forth, you'll get the water there a lot quicker. That's the kind of optimization and synergy they're talking about there. So like in this diagnosis, it's like identify what practices you do currently that fit this kind of mold. Like how do, and the answer might be you don't, right? Like you don't optimize anything about what you do, in which case you're probably in trouble. But another important part of System 3 is this kind of like resource bargain, or like internal allocation and planning. So that's a thing you're probably doing in your organization, right? Like you're probably doing some kind of, even unconsciously doing a kind of resource bargain of like, we're gonna dedicate X amount of resources to this project for the next month, and then we're going to understaff this other one for a while. But then once the first project's over, we'll switch around some resources and whatever. Or it might just be in financial terms, or whatever terms you have, right, for your internal sort of thing. And the other, I mean, like System 3 is one where a lot of things come together, and another important bit is like monitoring information that comes upwards to kind of get this model of get a model of the internal systems so that you can optimize it, but also like a capacity for sporadic audits. This is sometimes referred to as System 3 star, and I'm kind of not sure why it's so often referred to as like a semi-separate like appendage.
I think it's because it's an active investigation of lower systems. Like, so there's the monitoring, which is passive, right, and reactive, right? It's reactive, and then the audit function, the System 3 star function is like actually like investigating, going in and auditing, that kind of thing, and then the intervention channel, the command channel, the one that steps in and says, okay, we're revoking autonomy under these conditions, that one is like kind of only activated in the breach. Like it's like emergency powers, right? So I guess it's just the sense that like System 3 is kind of like a system for the internal part of the of the system, right? to use the really convoluted language, the internal part of the VSM, right?
The inner environment. Yeah, certainly. It
is very much the inner eye that is like seeking about, right?
Yeah, I think that for most people listening, like this is the part that would correspond most closely to the kind of like immediate middle management that they'd be familiar with, right? The kind of the first line of authority above the operational unit. An operational unit either being a person or a project or a whatever, or a department. There's this layer above that like is watching and has power to intervene. I mean, obviously with what we're going for here, it's not a personalized thing where it's that the role is given to somebody who is from a particular class background, and the whole thing is involved in reproducing a class division of power and so on and so forth. But this is familiar, right? Yeah.
I think the important thing that they say in describing System 3-star is that it should only be engaged with any particular operational unit, any System 1, like occasionally, right? Like you shouldn't be in there like micromanaging. That's just like interfering with autonomy, and it should be like transparent, right? So like the results of the audit should be shared with that system with the view of like improving it, right? Like it's like it should have that operational unit's interests in mind, and it should be clear about that, because the thing about middle management is like middle managers are largely self-interested. They tend to overmanage because they have like that's their job, that's their whole job, right, is to do the System 3-star thing, and so they tend to overdo it because it's the only way that they can exhibit productivity, right? Whereas the VSM doesn't really imply that at all. So in fact it's very much like cautioning against that tendency of that kind of like over-eager middle manager.
Yeah, definitely. That's definitely what we're going for there. System 4 should be one that's kind of relatively easy to identify. If you do future planning and like prediction and like watching the environment, for a lot of firms, it'll be watching the market, right, in a capitalist society. Yeah, I mean, if you're not doing that, I don't know, you're probably in big trouble. But that's one that's usually pretty easy to identify. It's your research and development, your kind of futures committee or whatever. But also like each person, and this is again emphasizing that point of like this is a depersonalized kind of process. Each person in the sort of operational units is probably doing a lot of this kind of thought in their heads anyway. And like getting it to be a formalized System 4 might just mean having regular planning meetings or regular kind of like big open discussions of like, okay, what do we think is coming? What do we think is the biggest problem in our environment, and what can we do to plan against it? Because as I said, right, like if you work for a company or whatever, and you're like just in the shower wondering, it's like, there's this big competitor thing, whatever, and like how are we going to deal with that? Like you were in System 4 while you're doing that. It's just you might need to formalize it a bit. And then System 5 is like you got to identify by what means are policy and like top level ethos decided. For a lot of companies, that's just going to be the personality of the fucking leader, the CEO. Like whatever that person's particular brain damage will be, whatever the policy happens to be, and that's just what you're stuck with in a capitalist fucking way of managing things. In Chile, or like with a lot of these applications of the VSM, we're instead looking at participatory sort of policy setting. You have like regular but not too regular big meetings with everyone involved, or like policy discovery processes where people suggest new things, all that kind of stuff, right? There's an infinity of different ways you could organize that, but the point here is to identify what is the policy? What are the high level sort of general policies of this organization, and how are they set, and how are they updated? Because if they're not updated ever, that's kind of, that's sketchy, right? That's a problem. Like, it's you just end up with like doing the same thing over and over again, or you would end up having a repetition of completely ineffective strategies.
Yeah, and really what System 5 is about is reconciling System 3 and 4.
Yeah, it conditions the loop, right, between System 3 and 4.
Yeah, because, System 3 is looking inward, System 4 is looking outward. The two are in communication, but it doesn't guarantee that there isn't going to be oscillation between those two, right? And so System 5 exists to basically, step in and make sure that you stop the system from getting out of balance, right? And so it's oftentimes when we think about System 5, like, you think about it as like, oh, this is like the CEO role or something like that, but it's like, not really. Like, yes, it is executive in a sense, but it's not like they do a lot of the things that the CEO is associated with. Like, a lot of that stuff is actually a part of System 4 or 3. And System 5 is more just like there as kind of like a fail-safe to ensure the cohesion of the entire organism. Yeah, so that's it's a decision-making organ.
Yeah, it's almost a sort of meta decision-making organ in that it conditions the decisions that 3 and 4 make. So I think an example, maybe to nail it down a bit more concretely, is that like for software developers, like a team that generally believes in agile principles or like Scrum principles or whatever, that's what the System 5 is there. It's the general policy, and it means that every like sort of plan, either like an internal plan or like a more external facing plan that's generated, can be kind of compared quickly against the policy of like, okay, we've decided to do X. Does that vaguely match a sort of agile thing? Okay, cool, right, go ahead. Or then, if we decide to do something else, it's like, oh, but that's like really badly against our ethos. Okay, well, then it needs to be replanned and so on. It's interesting that, like, I mean, Beer makes the allusion to System 5 being kind of like the higher, the sort of cortex and the kind of higher consciousness. And it's interesting just how much of a sort of bit player in the whole assemblage that is, right? That, like...
It really goes to show, like, the extent to which this is a very different view of the body than the one that we're used to.
Yeah.
Right? Like that... it has a kind of appreciation for the like autonomic systems of the body that is really unusual, I would say. It's like, oh yeah, like actually, the way, like the things your intestine does, the things that your lungs do, the things your heart does, the things your muscles do, are actually like really impressive and important.
yeah, totally.
And yeah, they have their own kind of intelligence to them.
It very much, it like emphasizes local intelligence and kind of machinic cunning as the main engine of activity, right? Like to kind of touch back on Pickering, right? Activity and performance is driven by autonomic cunning. And it's interesting to dwell on that word, right? Autonomic, like the autonomic nervous system is a nervous system that, allows for the autonomous operation of its wards, right? Like the organs. That word, the wording of autonomic nervous system is not an accident in sort of the study of biology.
Right. Yeah, that's right. And it's just a really different, really interesting view, and I think when you I don't think that Beer would by any means get into some kind of like weird point of view that that says that like biological existence or like bare life is already in itself sufficient, and the mind is just kind of like this afterthought, right? It is important, but it's more like the way in which this whole system comes together produces, all those like humanist wonderful things that we think about. And like that's really a more helpful way to think about it than you have this kind of like base that supports the really important mind, right? Like the body is there to support the mind. Because like when you think about the kinds of things that we view as like peak experiences, or like these like wonderful exemplary examples of what it means to be human and that we celebrate, they exist as a concert of all of the functions of our body, and like they literally could not like do otherwise, right? Like if we have this really like idealist view of our body, we might ignore them. But like when you really look at it in a materialist sense, like even sitting there and writing a great symphony, like it relies on a lot of muscle memory. It relies on a lot of habits of thought. It relies on obviously like the basic functioning of your organs. And like none of that stuff happens if the body as a whole is not functioning well. And so it's like really profoundly contrary to this dualist point of view. And I guess it's less to say that like the cerebral cortex, like the frontal brain, all that like that really like high functioning stuff is irrelevant so much. Rather, it's more like looking at like what does it actually do to ensure the viability of the system as a whole. And the answer is like it really doesn't do that much, right? Like it's there might be a lot of activity up there, but it's only facilitated by the rest of the system, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And like take all of that, right, and then map it onto social machines, social organisms, and social structures and organizations, and up from there, right? Like yeah, I mean, our present way of thinking about the body, our sort of mainstream present way of thinking about the body is woefully deficient, and in comparison to what you've just said, and our mainstream way of thinking about, I guess, social bodies, or the socius, is also woefully deficient. Yeah, this model of this different way of thinking about things, and this different way of emphasizing the sort of primacy of the sort of molecular activity of the thing and its performance of what it does, and the trusting first that the system operates properly, and then intervening when it doesn't, and trying to teach it how to operate better, and that sort of stuff, is so different from what we're accustomed to. This is a wildly different, and it's why Chile with Cybersyn is kind of, it's something that we has become in the sort of some part of the popular consciousness of the sort of contemporary left, has become an object of fascination, because it's this kind of this little crack in the door, right? The peak beyond into a potentially vastly different society, vastly improved, like not simply different, but like more autonomous, more effective, more efficient, as well as being more free. And yeah, like, oh boy, incredible,
Yeah, and like you really, you can look at examples like that, or you can look at smaller scale examples like the ones that are included in the guide, and see that like this can actually work, right? Like this, it can work, and there are also like really positive effects that it has as a kind of generator of like life experience, right? Like you kind of get in the description of I think the first cooperative, like the author saying that, working here was like one of the most pleasurable things I ever did in my life, even though the work was largely what we would consider to be like quote unquote menial labor, because the systems were functioning well towards a valuable purpose. It was actually far more rewarding than doing something that we might consider to be like, this is a great job, right? Like, I'm the director of planning at so and so. No, in fact, having this kind of like synchronized system of work was way more enjoyable, way more valuable, and it really does speak to that kind of like point that Marx was getting at in his work on alienation, about the value of getting away from a really strict division of labor in society, and the alienation that implies.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, I mean, we're going to skip over some of these later chapters, which are basically kind of like walking through piece by piece, like how to design for autonomy, how to design information systems. They're well worth reading, but I think we've covered pretty much everything that they say. So I mean, wrapping up, like, I mean, I think I've already brought it up, but I think one of the things I really love about this is that it depersonalizes management and makes it a kind of a machine process rather than something that is a sort of specific role and involved in the reproduction of a class society, which I think is pretty excellent. For like, I'm aware that we've been mostly keeping our examples and our discussion in terms of like workplaces and companies and so on, and that's, I mean, largely because, I mean, that's the terminology that's used here. It's the context that a lot of this stuff was developed for, but I mean, it applies to all kinds of organizations, including political organizations or workers organizations, like your when we're developing workers' power, we're probably going to end up, hopefully going to end up using some of these models and lessons, right? And I think that's going to be effective because it's a kind of organization in a box that you can just deploy. And like, I think if the viable system model became something that was well understood and sort of widely studied throughout the workers' movement, throughout the contemporary left, it would just be something you could roll in and go, okay, we have this big thing we need to do. How are we going to organize it? Well, we've got this thing called the VSM. We'll just do that again. If it could become a standard, essentially, it would be kind of awesome, because that would be an alternative to the usual build it from scratch bullshit that you get with, political organizing of like, we have this big thing to do. How are we going to organize it? I don't know. We'll improvise. And it's like, I mean, I like free jazz as much as anyone, but, building a workers' movement is probably not the time for fucking improvisation of that kind. Or building, your political organizations, or when you really have something you need to do.
Yeah, and I mean, it's notably distinct from sort of like taking the principles of a Leninist party and setting up a Leninist party according to like the lines that were handed down by the Comintern, so many years ago, because the VSM, it doesn't prescribe like all of the specifics of how this organization should work, because you really have to do reason actively from the situation you find yourself in, as opposed to just say, okay, we got this party constitution, let's deploy it, let's go, right? In fact, like, there's been a lot of discussion on like from Alpha to Omega about the question of like, well, what was the situation in which the Leninist Party was developed? It was like, it's a situation of like, revolutionary civil war. That isn't necessarily the situation that all of us find ourselves in. And then we could even analyze that party form from a perspective of viability to see like, well, does it actually even do the thing it says it's supposed to do? So there's a certain level to which, like, yeah, it's not build it from scratch, but it's also not fucking deploy your Docker container style of political organization, right? There's a certain amount of active intelligence to the development of an organization fit to the situation you find yourself in.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I guess what I sort of was trying to get at with the sort of org in a box thing was that if it were a sort of standard, it would just eliminate a decision as to like how are we going to go about that analysis. Like, you're totally right. It's not something that you can just like it doesn't come in a briefcase that you can just open and like here's the thing. It's not like a pop-up tent. It is something that you absolutely need to engage with and design and to do actively. But I think this could, like, if it was well understood and widely deployed, it could just become a kind of standard template for doing this sort of stuff, and that would make the entire movement more effective. Like, because that would be a System 2 level thing of like standardization and to get very meta about it, right? For the entire sort of socialist project could have a sort of standard procedure for going about this stuff, right? Like, and it'd be to use the VSM and so on. Yep. I think I also love how it focuses on like the purpose of a system's that, like, your sort of trot sect that just has meetings for their own sake, that can't possibly be your primary purpose.
Yeah.
That is like literally invalid as a primary purpose in the model. Like the meetings and the management stuff is strictly secondary, and has to be. So yeah, get out of here, trots. And selling newspapers can't be your fucking main purpose either. Come on.
Podcasting, that's the way to the people's revolution.
Do you think in 50 or 60 years people will be making jokes about along the lines of like trot selling newspapers?
There's Johnny. He's making his podcast. Oh, ridiculous. Yeah, well, who knows?
Yeah, and I think as well a big upside is this could move us past the kind of pointless oscillation between centralization and decentralization, because it turns out there's a science of organization, right? And it kind of gives you an answer to those big questions, such that the framing of kind of like absolute centralization or absolute decentralization or that kind of anarchic thing for the latter example is just sort of rendered kind of pointless, which I like. I wanted to sort of mention as well, like, the potential sort of dangers of this bodily metaphor, because I mean it obviously leans on this bodily metaphor pretty heavily, but that like the state form of like both implementation and the state form of thought that we all know and despise is kind of inherited from this kind of like Platonic Cartesian sort of way of thinking about separation of rules from rulers, the separation of mind from body, and this sort of thing. There's a lot of resonance in those kind of concepts that kind of co-evolved with each other. Those guys, like, I mean, the Platonic sort of republic sort of stuff, that is also based in a bodily metaphor. It's a different one, like it's one that happens to be wrong, but it is a simple appeal to the metaphors of the human body is not enough, right? So I think it would be easy to misread this VSM stuff as being a kind of validation of that sort of Platonic stuff. It could also be misread easily as kind of being a sort of defense of like the kind of quasi-Nazi sort of stuff you get with like organic corporalism or organic centralism, because like the VSM is very much about the opposite of that. It's about immanent self-rule, right? But it can be the way that it uses the metaphors and stuff can be misread as very non-immanent, transcendent kind of elite rule. It's like I can imagine somebody looking at the diagram and just going, "Oh yeah, that's where the God King sits in System 4, and the philosopher kings are in System 4 and 3, and then all the plebs are in System 1." It would be a very bad reading, but it could be done, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is not only like theoretical. This is something that like constantly plagued Buer during his life. right? Like people misunderstanding the system as that, right? Like, there's a brain with an eyeball looking inward. Oh, that sounds like the panopticon to me. That kind of thing. Please don't read it that way. That's not what the point is.
Yeah, exactly. So I think what I'm trying to get at there is that, like, I think it's like I think is as probably a theme for the show in general, right? Like, we're talking about necessary but insufficient. That this is a necessary but in isolation insufficient component of a better future. It has to be coupled with elimination of class society. It has to be coupled to a real workers' movement. You mean yada yada yada, all the stuff, right? Like, it wouldn't be enough to just say, here's the VSM, go nuts. Because I mean, I could totally see that working out as a technocratic nightmare. And I want to touch on something that, like, the way one of our patrons put it was that, like, we need to and this is very much our project, right? Like, claiming cybernetics and claiming the viable system model as socialist technology. Explicitly, that this is socialist technology. This is a socialist way of organizing a society, and really, really pushing on that. Yeah. Is there anything else you'd like to cover before we wrap it up?
Well, I think for me the thing that was most interesting about all of this was, as like a tabletop role playing game designer, I'm used to writing sort of like instructional text for performance. And this VSM guide, kind of like really was interesting to me at that level. As opposed to the broad strokes, like, for example, the back half of the book is like quite repetitive, but you can see its value as a instructional text, and just going from text to performance. And of course we've talked with Pickering about how important performance is to cybernetics. Seeing that transition happen was really intriguing to me, and just seeing the VSM as like an active tool to be performed as opposed to a metaphysical construct. That was really what got me going with this particular set of readings. And it was really like, okay, I read this and then I was like, all right, like, let's go make a working group for the VSM on the Discord, because I can actually see, having read this, like, how to do the VSM as opposed to just how to think about it. And then we'll see where it goes from there. But it was inspiring to me in that way specifically.
Yeah, it's good. I love it. It's great stuff. And I think we'll have to do something more about this sort of stuff in the future. Yeah, cool. Thanks, listeners, for listening to us on this one and for following along with the show. If you want to catch up with us on the internet, we're on Twitter at GIUnitPod. We're on Facebook if you search for General Intellect Unit. If you want to support the show, there's a couple of ways to do that. You share us around with friends and anyone you think would be interested. And the second best way to support us is to go to patreon.com/General Intellect Unit. Throw us a couple of bucks a month to support the show and to get in on a new thing that we're doing. We've got a Discord channel now for our patrons, and it is fucking great. Like, we dragged our heels on setting that up for so fucking long, and I was absolutely dreading pulling the trigger on it, but it has been nothing but wonderful. Great community, really wonderful discussion. It's a great place to be. You need to subscribe at the $5 per month level, but I think the value exchange for that is great.
Yeah, if you're actually interested in these subjects in any kind of deep way, there's a lot of interesting people to chat with on there.
Yeah, definitely. A lot of really smart folks that are like intimidatingly smart, and I'm like, oh my god, I'm in way over my head here. Yeah. And like, I mean, that's the only thing we offer as any kind of reward, because like we're still pretty adamant on not putting the sort of material, at least the main material, behind a paywall, because this show is a research program for us, and we kind of wanted to reach the maximum audience possible. Yeah, good stuff. Okay, I think that's it. We'll catch you again in a couple of weeks with I don't know, we haven't planned that yet. Yeah, thanks for listening, and bye-bye.
Bye.